collapse of our banking, mortgage, and automobile manufacturing industries have pushed the Obama administration into a spend, spend, spend remedy mode, believing that spending more is the way out of this recession. And what do they have to show for it? Record unemployment, record bank failures, a looming second, this time commercial mortgage crisis, and serious talks of the potential collapse of the dollar. My next guest, Robert Higgs, is the Senior Fellow in Political Economy for the Independent Institute and editor of the Institute's quarterly journal, The Independent Review. He argues why running up of government spending is not a sensible way out of the recession. Robert, my good friend, Professor Higgs, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Don't the people in Washington know that the Hoover, FDR, spend, extended the Depression from 1929 to 1946 or 48, whenever it ended? And haven't they learned the lessons that government borrowing and spending makes things worse rather than better?
Unfortunately, Judge, they've learned all the wrong lessons from the New Deal and the Great Depression, so it's more common to hear them say that what was wrong with the Great Depression was not the actions taken, but that they were too timid, that the New Deal should have done what it did, but done it on a bigger scale or more vigorously.
The New Deal did so many horrendous things to freedom. There were the codes of the various industries that made you charge a certain amount of money. I remember reading about it, may even be in your book, Crisis in Leviathan, a dry cleaner in Jersey City, New Jersey, who charged 35 cents instead of the prescribed 40 cents to clean and press a man's suit of clothing. He was convicted in a federal court in Newark and spent 3 months in jail for trying to undercharge his competition by 5 cents.
Yeah.
Do you think that we are in for that level of micromanaging the economy by bureaucrats in Washington in this present recession?
Well, unfortunately, we're moving in that direction right now. We started, of course, with various efforts to, as it were, get credit being extended again. The beginning of all this, so far as most people noticed, was last September when a so-called credit freeze or credit crunch took place, and the government's first efforts, particularly the Federal Reserve System's efforts, were directed at getting credit markets working again. But very quickly, of course, the government began to take other actions and ended up taking ownership of 600 or so banks, and or partial ownership by purchasing preferred shares instead of purchasing the so-called toxic assets that the TARP program was intended to permit. And now the upshot of that, most recently, is that the government has begun to actually set the compensation terms for bank managers in some of the banks that receive large amounts.
You know, this TARP program is one of the biggest frauds, one of the biggest bait and switches I've ever seen. I read the documents that evidenced the purchase by the Treasury Department of the preferred shares of stock. This goes back to September and October of 2008. We're in the Bush administration now.
Yeah.
This is when Henry Paulson went to George Bush and said, the sky is falling. Give me a blank check for $700 billion and I'll stop mortgage foreclosures. Well, we know what they did. They bought shares of stock from banks. Some banks wanted the cash, some banks didn't. And nothing was in those documents that said, as a result of our minority ownership, we'll put aside General Motors and AIG, where the feds have a majority ownership. As a result of our minority ownership, we can control management decisions. Comes the Obama administration 6 months later in February, they enact legislation that says, you know that money that we gave you in return for the stock 6 months ago? Well, even if we only own a minority of the stock, we can control salaries and we can control management decisions. I mean, that is fascism, private ownership, but government control. And it was done after the fact. It was done retroactively. Would those banks have even taken the money had they known that the feds could control salaries and investment decisions?
Well, I'm sure that that this is a very thorny issue for the banks. Of course, the last thing that bank managers want is to have somebody else controlling their compensation, and particularly whacking away at it and slicing it by 50% or so. But even more ominous, Judge, is that now the Fed is proposing that it have the authority to control the compensation for managers in all banks. The thousands and thousands of banks that got no federal assistance whatsoever.
Well, will this madness never end? Robert Higgs, thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
You're welcome, Judge.